Okay, welcome everyone. Pleased to have Bamdad Hosseini, who's local. He's an assistant professor in the applied math department. He's been around for a while, so I'm pleased to finally have him speak in our department. I've known him for a long time, since he was a postdoc at Caltech when I was a grad student there. And he had done his PhD at SFU, so up north in Canada. And his work is pretty broad, I would say. If there is some math in it and some interesting probability and statistics in it, he's one that is probably interested to work on it. And he's, as a result, made contributions in many, many areas, broadly in kind of scientific machine learning, which would be the focus of his talk.
Thank you.
So please help me invite him. Oh, and give the Career Award. I forgot to say that. So he's received a lot of awards.
Not that many, actually. All right. Thank you, Armin. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. So I'm in the applied math department, 2-minute walk from Philadelphia. And so I've actually, I've interacted with the statistics department a little bit over the last kind of 4 years I've been here. But honestly, I wish I could do more. So I thought in my talk today a little bit, I'll tell you about some of the projects I'm very excited about. But because time is limited, I'm not going to talk about everything. But I thought I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I should also apologize. I'm a Linux guy, and Zoom on Linux doesn't really work that well. This is why I need to keep the banner on, otherwise the screen share doesn't work. Who knows why? So hope it's not too irritating. Yeah, anyway, so this is kind of a map of my research. So I was trained as an applied mathematician, really as, someone who likes PDEs and numerical analysis and that sort of thing. And then over my PhD, I started to propagate into probability and statistics, mainly in Bayesian inference, kind of for uncertainty quantification, Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms in function spaces, that sort of thing. So I was roughly kind of working on inverse problems on UQ. And then about 4 years ago, which was, more like 7 years ago, was when machine learning was kind of coming up and becoming a bigger thing in applied mathematics. That's when I also met Armin. I started to work on the side of machine learning. And then over the last 6-7 years, all of the stuff I did kind of seemed to eventually culminate into something that nowadays is roughly called scientific machine learning, which means machine learning techniques for essentially problems in scientific computing. Sometimes it's also called physics-informed machine learning. You want to think machine learning when the unknown parameters are functions, typically, so non-parametric stuff. And there is constraints in the form of partial differential equations involved somewhere in there. Okay. So that's roughly what I do. To be more specific, I have kind of 2 programs since I've been at UW. The one on the right is the one I mainly talk about today, which is the physics-informed machine learning using Gaussian processes. Zaid has told me multiple times I'm a vintage guy. I like Gaussian processes and kernel methods, not so much neural nets. So that's what I'm talking about today. Here, the ideas are kind of solving PDEs and learning the solution maps and that sort of thing using Gaussian processes and kernel methods. And then I have another program, which actually a lot of it was developed since I was here, which uses transport problems for conditional transport, computational transport problems like optimal transport and other types of transport like generative modeling, normalizing flows and that sort of thing. Largely, again, all of them developed for problems where partial differential equations are involved to explain physical processes. So when we had the Kantorovich initiative here, joint with math and statistics and applied math, I learned a lot of things from interacting people in the initiative. And actually, a lot of the theory we do here, quantitative error bound, that sort of thing, is stuff I also learned from the stats department. I actually sat in on a bunch of the course in the 580 sequence, the statistical learning theory and generalization bounds. So we do a lot of those things for kind of generative models, but again, for physical processes. Cool. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely based on this particular preprint. Hopefully, it's going to get updated very soon, but it's actually very much it's not going to be any big changes. So this was done by colleagues, collaboration with colleagues at Caltech and my students here. So Yasami is a PhD student at Caltech. Juan and Alex are PhD students here in the applied math program working with me, and Humano Hadi is a senior colleague at Caltech, who's an expert in kernel methods and numerical analysis. All right, so the talk is very interactive, so please don't just, don't feel like you need to be quiet and not ask me questions. I actually have designed it so that we can kind of go through it together. I'm going to spend most of my time, maybe all of my time, on talking about the overview of the problem and the method that I'll show you. Then I'm going to have a quick time event for you guys to decide if you want to see a little bit more of our theory or our algorithms. Okay. All right. So what is the problem we're interested in? So there are three problems roughly that the scientific machine learning community cares about. These three are here listed on the board. So generally, you want to think about a partial differential equation. So here in abstract notation, I write P of U equals to F. So you want to think about this like something like the heat equation, right? Elasticity equations, Navier-Stokes equations, some kind of a nonlinear, possibly partial differential equation, where U is the unknown, is the state of the system. F is assumed to be roughly known. That's the input to the system, is boundary conditions, source term, that sort of thing. So we have three problems that we care about in scientific machine learning. One is classical, essentially. These are PDE solvers. The idea is, given the differential operator P and the right-hand side F, the source term, we would like to know the solution to the PDE, right? So you solve this using numerical methods. Roughly, the idea is you come up with a U hat that is a good estimator of U. And typically, the way you do this is because you know P, you try to find a U hat such that it minimizes the residual. So P of U hat is close to F. The way we think about this, sort of, if you've seen numerical PDE solvers, like finite element solvers, finite difference solvers, that sort of thing, at the end of the day, all of them are building an approximation to the solution map of this equation. So that's this P hat, P inverse hat. So I put a hat on the whole thing because a PDE solver approximates the solution map itself. So that's classical. This is essentially all of numerical PDEs. But then new problems have kind of come around that are these two. So there's learning PDEs. This also has a name in control theory. We're in the Guggenheim, so aerospace department is here. The engineers used to call this system identification. Nowadays, it's more like known as the learning PDE. The idea is that now you don't know the differential operator. You don't know the physical laws that govern the system. However, you have some sort of snapshots of the system. So there are U's and F's, pairs of them. There are capital M of these. This is of your training data. You don't really know P, and your goal is to find P itself. So your goal is to find a P hat that is a good approximation to the P itself. So again, here your goal is, in a sense, you want to discover the physical laws that govern the system. And then there's the third problem, which also, again, in engineering has been of interest for a long time. So things like reduced order models or model order reduction have kind of looked at this in statistics literature. These were called surrogate models, kind of the Kennedy-O'Hagan type approaches. In machine learning, the name has become operator learning. And the idea is, again, you have the same data as equation learning, but what you're trying to do is, again, go after the inverse map, so the solution map of the PDE. So if you look at these, I specifically wrote them in this notation so this connection becomes clear. Learning PDEs and operator learning are the same problem. It's just that the domain and range are flipped. So in equation learning or PDE learning, you want to map from U to F. In operator learning, you want to map from F to U, because your goal is to kind of quickly or cheaply emulate the solution map of the PDE. And when you do PDE solvers, that's a little bit different. You don't have training data, you know the operator itself, but then you don't know the inverse, so you try to invert it approximately. Okay. So what I'm going to propose to you today is that there is a way we can essentially unify all of these into the same kind of mathematical framework and actually get an algorithm that will do something interesting for us. Okay. And what I want to pitch to you is that the key step, the kind of like node that really helps you connect everything together is this learning of equations that brings things together and lets you do some impressive things. All right, so just to put things in a little bit of more kind of concrete ground. So this is the kind of problem I'm going to look at. So I have an example of a partial differential equation. Here, this is the Berger's PDE. It's if you haven't seen this before, this is kind of a PDE that describes a kind of wave phenomenon. So it's like a baby version of a fluid flow problem. It's a nonlinear PDE because you have a u times du dx here. And its solution looks something like this. So this is in one dimension, this is x, that's t. Here I'm plotting the entire solution in space and time. So this initial condition, boundary conditions on the top and bottom side, and then the solution evolves in time. And you can see that there's a sharp interface here. This is basically a shock developing in the solution, which is one of the interesting things about Berger's equation is that you can sort of start with smooth solutions and end with sharp shocks in your solution. Okay. So the problem we're going to look at is the problem of trying to estimate or discover the equation itself. So we don't know that the equation is this one that I have up here. And we want to, after we discover it, we want to be able to also solve it. So evaluate the solution map of the equation. So essentially for a different initial condition, we want to be able to simulate the trajectory of the system. The data that we have is very sparse. So the data that I have are essentially these red dots on this panel. Okay, so you can see that I kind of have more dots on the boundary. So I know the initial condition pretty well. I know the boundary condition pretty well. But in the interior of the domain, I only have few of these red observations and they're scattered. So there are sparse observations. And if you pay attention, for example, I miss all of these sharp interfaces pretty much. So the question that we want to look at again is given this sparse set of observations, so this UM of xm, this is the solution, that panel evaluated on the red points, that's the xm, we might have some noise, and then we know the forcing term, which in this case is just the initial condition of the PDE. Okay. Given this information, we want to learn p hat, that is a good approximation to p itself, and we want to also be able to estimate the solution map, so simulate the state of the system for new input. And the key idea that we're going to kind of carry through the talk is this observation that the order in which you learn these operators is very important. So in particular, for most physical systems, the P itself, the differential operator, is much easier to learn than the solution map of the PDE. The reason is, for example, if you stare at Berger's equation here in the top right, this is a very simple nonlinear equation. So there are linear operators at work. Those are the differentiation operators. So you have u the solution, du dx, du dxx, and du dt. Those are all linear operators. If I tell you that your PDE is defined in terms of those specific linear operators, the nonlinearity is just a multiplication. So this whole thing, the nonlinear part of the equation is nothing but a polynomial nonlinearity, second order polynomial. So the idea is if you have sparse data, you're going to have enough information to discover or learn that polynomial nonlinearity. However, the solution map of the PDE, which is the mapping from the initial condition to the whole trajectory here, essentially from, if you like, from this to the whole picture, is a much more complicated map. It's an infinite dimensional map, so you won't have a hope of being able to estimate it using very sparse data. Okay? All right. So far, so good? Yeah.
I guess I'm confused, like this idea of PDE learning, which is like learning the P hats, that people have done this, and your point is to just So did not people think about the inversion before as well to get the U hat or no? Like what?
So there is so if I understand correctly, your point is people have done p hat
Yeah,
estimation before.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of it was developed here.
Yeah.
And you're saying, why haven't people done this?
Yeah.
So for ODEs, you can do this. So if you look at Nathan's work on Cindy and that sort of thing, for ODEs, you can do this because ODE solvers are designed to deal with nonlinear models anyways. For PDEs, you cannot do this. Why? Because if I give you a p hat, if you just estimate it from data, these things typically have very non-trivial nonlinearities. And you're going to need like a bespoke PDE solver or something that can deal with it, especially because the equation that you discover is often ill-defined. So it doesn't have a solution, it's not uniquely solvable, all those things. On top of that, the sparsity of the data is the key here for us. So if I give you this sort of data with very sparse observations, the previous methods don't work. And I actually have numerics show you what goes on.
Like meaning the p hat is not very good?
The p hat will be very bad. Yeah.
Can I also ask
That's
a
kind of one
question?
of the selling points. Yeah.
So there's the shop for burgers, but don't you have a confusion? Or you're not?
I have so this is a mild shot, you're right. So I have a tiny diffusion, but that diffusion for us is pretty small. So it's 0.01-ish here. But still, you see that this is not like an exact shot, but it is a shot interface, right? And you will see in a second when I show you numerics, you will never be able to capture this, of course, because you don't have enough information, but you can come close to it. Yeah.
Sorry, do you guys hear me
Cool.
on Zoom?
Any more questions?
No?
So how can we think about the idea of parking in the solution that you're up, right? In the idea of overheating and calibrating that, you can.
Yeah, so
the data, how does.
So we deal with that with regularizations because exactly you're going to have infinitely many solutions to this. So there will be infinitely many PDEs, infinitely many possible states that will fit the data. So you will have to regularize this, and that's where the Gaussian process idea comes in, which is you need to pick a minimum complexity essentially model. So the kind of Cindy stuff, which is the previous methods, will look at like sparsity over a dictionary. They do like lasso type things. Here we're gonna more propose like a Gaussian process model, which is just shrinking the RKHS model. Yeah. Yeah, that one is inevitable, like any inference problem. Yeah. Cool. So the key observation that lets you deal with the sparse data regime. Yeah.
Seems like something on that. Can you just make sure I know that?
Do you hear us on Zoom? Oh, I don't. Okay.
Do you hear me now?
Oh, wait. Hold on, let me. Ali, can you say something?
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Okay.
Perfect. So maybe a naive question, but sort of going back to the previous slide. So what are the, so in this example, in Berger's PDE, what are the parameters that are being estimated? U is being estimated here. So the form is known, but we're estimating U in this case?
No. We are gonna assume P is unknown, so the form is not known. Okay. I'm gonna assume that the linear operators are known in a second, but in general, the nonlinear form of P is unknown and U is unknown. You can assume that F is known. I
see. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is the slide. I'm gonna explain the setup for us. So the kind of key observation that lets you go to these sparse regimes is this fact that if you think about a lot of PDEs that appear in kind of physics, they're going to have this general form where there is a nonlinear function being composed with a mapping which is essentially x, the input coordinates. So if you have a variable coefficients, you have dependencies on x, first order derivatives of the solution, second order derivatives of the solution, and so on and so forth. So for Berger's equation, you essentially go up to D2, which is second order derivatives of U. So we call this thing phi, which is just a mapping that is linear in U. It's just you give it U and X, it returns that vector of X and partial derivatives of U. And again, the key observation is for most PDEs that you care about, the nonlinearity is purely embedded inside this function P, and it's not super complicated. So as an example, this is a nonlinear elliptic PDE I have down here. So this thing has the second order PDE has a variable coefficient, which you generally don't know. And then you have a nonlinearity. I just put a polynomial nonlinearity just for simplicity here. So in this case, you take phi to be x, ux, du dx evaluated at x, du dxx evaluated at x. And then the nonlinearity in the equation is this function p I had up here. It's just a function defined on R4. So the s's just represent the input to p. And it's nothing but dA dx S1 times S3 and so on and so forth. Okay. So the key observation is if your data is sparse, this thing is just a 4-dimensional nonlinear function. It's much easier to estimate than an infinite dimensional mapping between function spaces. So you should go after this and then try to estimate the solution map separately. So how do you do this? So in the kind of general setup, so in the most abstract framework, again, we assume we know phi, so we know what differential operators are involved. If you're wondering about practice, in practice, you can do this by just throwing in a dictionary of linear operators that you want and then trying to prune it later. Or you can do things like cross-validation type things. For now, we don't go there, just assume phi is no. Training data, you pick some abstract spaces, U and P, and then you formulate an optimal recovery problem, right? So here, the important observation, and this kind of one of the key innovations here is we have to formulate the optimization problem here for the equation and the state of the system at the same time. So in my notation, Q is my candidate for P. The V's are my candidates for the U's. I need to estimate the state of the system, the U itself, and the equation at the same time, okay? So the constraints for this optimization problem are the observations. Here, I'm not doing the noisy case, I'm just doing the interpolation case. So the V's have to interpolate the data that I've seen for the U's. That means I have to interpolate these red points. If you have noise, you just make this a regression type thing. But there's an important second constraint, which is that the PDE that you're estimating or you're discovering has to be satisfied by the states that you're estimating. So this is the key step that allows, if you want to think, you might have multiple snapshots of the system. There's very little information in each snapshot, but all the snapshots will be coupled together through the PDE that you are also trying to discover. And this is going to make the optimization and the algorithms and everything a lot more interesting. Why? Because the V's are appearing in the constraint for Q, right? This also makes the optimization much harder because if you change the functions, the V's a little bit, you're going to change the higher order derivatives by quite a lot, which is going to make the constraint for Q get violated by a large margin, which means your optimization is actually pretty nasty and pretty stiff. The way we deal with this, I mean, I don't think I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but so I have that U and the P, I have function spaces to pick. So we use reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces because they have a lot of nice mathematical structure, but underneath all of this, we also have a nice Gaussian process interpretation. In this talk, I'm not going to go there because here we were mainly developing algorithms, but we have projects now we're working on to actually bring in the UQ for this. This is just a reminder slide for RKHSs. So remember, you have a positive definite symmetric kernel K. Through this kernel, you kind of define your pre-Hilbert space, which is essentially functions that are in the span of your kernel. Then you can define an inner product on this pre-Hilbert space using the positive definite property of your kernel, meaning that your kernel matrix is always PDS. Then you complete this with respect to your inner product, you get an RKHS. And we have our usual favorite property, which is the reproducing property, which is that the kernel is the Riesz representative of pointwise evaluation for elements of the RKHS. So what we do now is we simply take, this is now we're heading towards an algorithm, same setup as before. I just put U and P into RKHSs. So this works well for a lot of kind of scientific computing problems, especially PDEs, because you typically want to pick something like a matern kernel for U, because matern kernel, the RKHS is a subgroup space. Most PDEs, subgroup spaces are the natural model class for them. For P, typically you want something involving a polynomial kernel or some kind of hybrid of polynomial and matern, because for most PDEs, the nonlinearities are of polynomial form, and the X dependencies are again in subgroup classes. So it's very natural to kind of build bespoke kernels that you have a lot of control to put expert knowledge into them, and then they just show up inside your algorithm in kind of an automated way. There's one more thing we do, which if you've been paying attention, I have these gray dots on the plot that I haven't thought about. So the second constraint, which was the PDE constraint itself, you cannot impose it because it's an infinite constraint. And because for RKHS methods, you typically want to have finitely many kind of interpolation or linear constraints. We pick a collocation mesh, so that's the gray points here, and we only impose the PDE on those gray points. So this is the part where this problem is now starting to couple with PDE solvers. So PDE solvers essentially impose this constraint over a model class. Those are the collocation method, finite difference, spectral collocation. Things like finite element can also be written in some constraints related to this. Now we have an optimization problem, RKHS norms on everything, and bunch of constraints. This last constraint is nonlinear, and that's the one that kind of makes things a bit interesting. So the key, again, idea I want to highlight one more time is that the key is you really need to keep the fact that these constraints are imposed at the same time, and that you're doing optimization and everything all at once. So this is something that is not entirely new. Actually, this was known, for example, a while ago in inverse problem literature, that the inverse problem guys kind of discovered this, that a lot of times if you do unknown parameters and the state at the same time, it actually gives you better results. The main difference now is we're going to cases where you really don't even know the equation, whereas in inverse problems, typically there's like a specific parameter that you don't know, like a diffusion coefficient or something like that. So how do we actually solve this? So now we go towards kind of like optimization algorithms. So this is just a summary. We can decide if you want to see some more of the details. Essentially, what you do is you relax your constraints. So if you had noisy data, you would also use a similar loss to this. So we replace the hard constraints with penalties, right? So minimum residual penalties. Then you have a problem that essentially looks an awful lot like a kernel regression problem, kernel ridge regression. So you apply the kernel trick. You get a representative theorem for this. So essentially you discretize the problem without losing too much. And then this is where the kind of interesting stuff happens, is you need to deal with this compositional model, this compositional term in the residual, in this last term. And here is where we are going to do a linearization, and then we apply a Lavenberg-Marcotte algorithm. So Lavenberg-Marcotte, if you haven't seen it before, it's essentially a quasi-Newton algorithm, because you have quadratic penalties and everything's quadratic. You would want to do a Newton algorithm. Don't do SGD stuff, doesn't work. So do a quasi-Newton algorithm where at every step you build a quadratic approximation to the whole loss, and then you minimize that quadratic loss. Okay. The Lavenberg-Marcotte part is essentially you throw in an extra loss term that says, I don't want to take too big of a step. That kind of is ideas from trust region methods. Because this is very stiff, sometimes you're going to get bad estimates of the loss that are going to kick you out of the good minima and then off to infinity. So Newton will fail. Lavenberg-Marcotte will control that. It only allows you to use the quadratic approximation only locally and not leave the kind of good regions of the loss. Okay, so by the time you've solved this, hopefully, you have estimate of the states and you have estimate of the equation. So you get the p hat. So you've done in the problems I had on my list, you're now done with problem 2. Okay. And problem 1 has kind of appeared through this constraint. So PD solver, PD learning. Now we get to the operator learning part. And the operator learning part is what Armin was asking about. So the question is, you discovered p hat, right? So you define a differential operator. You would like to invert it, but this thing is not an invertible operator. It can have weird nonlinearities, lack of existence of solutions, lack of stability, and all of that. How do we deal with it? The same way that you deal with ill-conditioned matrices. So you're going to actually take the same optimization problem we had before, and there's no data anymore. There's no snapshot data. So you throw those terms away. What you're left with is the PDE residual, and then a penalty for stability. Okay. So we just solved this optimization problem exactly using the same code we had. Actually, this is the nice thing about the method is you just run the same code you had just with less data. And we call this p hat dagger, that this is about just borrowing notation from linear algebra because it's like a penalized least squares problem. It's like the pseudo inverse of a matrix. So it's looking for a minimum RKHS norm solution that is going to minimize the residual of the PDE you've discovered, right? And this gives you enough stability that you can actually find you can't guarantee it's unique because of nonlinearity, but typically it gives you a good solution.
I was a bit confused, like the previous optimization problem, you were solving these V's, you were getting like, wouldn't that already give you the inverse? So I thought you're doing it all together with one optimization
Got it.
problem, but what am I missing here?
Right. So here, that F is a new F you haven't seen before. So in this problem, Fm and Um are paired. That's training data. It's like supervised learning.
Oh,
But in the new problem, actually, I should have mentioned that. Thank you. So in the new problem, there's a new F that comes along. You've never seen the system being pushed with this forcing, and you want to know what's the state of the system. In the Berger's example, think like new initial condition that wasn't in the training data. Yep. Cool. Yeah.
For the relaxation,
Mhm.
the only constraint that's like, because you're assuming you have noisy observation, or if you want to have a tractable problem solved, but
It's more the second. So there is a optimization problem you can formulate for the full-blown, like the equality constraint problem, but then the condition number is going to become a little bit problematic, especially with kernel methods. So you have to add some nugget terms. So typically you would do those just for numerical stability. They're very small, right? Here, these lambda primes are exactly playing the role of nugget terms. So typically you pick these to be so that you actually impose the PDE and the constraints very aggressively, right? But they're mainly there for numerical stability. However, if you have noise in the observations, then you would want to pick this lambda prime to be like 1/2 sigma squared, which is meaningful for your, and then maybe scale it off of that. But if you don't have noise, you just want to pick these to be large enough that the optimization problem is well conditioned enough you can solve it to high enough accuracy, but you don't want to just willy-nilly make them large. Okay. There is an added benefit to the second one. So if you want to really get into the details of the optimizers, you probably want to schedule these things so it becomes a little bit like a continuation or annealing method. Because the fact that you don't actually impose the PDE super aggressively at the beginning of the optimization where you don't know the equation really well, this will help you. Because think about it like this, if you impose the wrong PDE and then you adjust the use, you're going to get penalized a lot. So you really make the loss really, really steep, right? So you want to make this thing relaxed so that you can kind of settle into like a good minimum and then make it more aggressive. So you can kind of schedule these things. Yeah.
So there is a way in which you should think about, I mean, at least in my mind, you should think about the lambda double prime.
Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, it has to depend on how sparse your observations are.
Yeah.
So if I think, simple, just a line, it's kind of Nyquist frequency. So there's only so much that you reconstruct out of observations depending on the frequency of the samples.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you have thought about kind of ways to think about lambda double prime in terms of just the size of the grid. I mean, it's the observations are not necessarily that great, but you can think about it in the smallest grid.
Yeah. The Nyquist thing is a very good observation. I've been thinking about this actually recently. So here, we haven't done that yet because here actually we just set it and leave it. So we pick these lambda primes and dog primes using some heuristics that seem to work pretty well just for our problems. But I've been thinking about your question. I don't have a good answer for you yet, actually, because I've been thinking about it in the sense of like, is this actually letting you go past Nyquist? Because in some sense it can, if you can do a good enough job of finding the PDE itself. But the thing that makes it very non-trivial for me is it's very natural to think about Nyquist stuff for the use because you're just observing them. But then the PDE, you never really see the PDE itself, right? In fact, this is like a generalized least squares problem where you don't know the input points themselves are also wrong and the data is noisy also. So that one is a little bit, I don't have a good answer for it, but I'm curious about it actually. Yeah, good question. All right. Okay, let me now show you pretty pictures. So this is Sandberger's equation. Sorry, it's blocked out. So I'm showing you three examples, well, two examples. So let me walk you through this. This is the first one we've seen so far. This column, Keiko, this is our method, the one that I was showing you, kernel equation learning. The pin, this is physics-informed neural nets with sparse recovery. So this is actually also a joint optimization problem that uses a sparse, like lasso over a dictionary for the equation, and then a neural net to solve the PDE. So the U is a neural net, P is a sparse over a dictionary. This last one is the one Armin was asking about. This is what you get from Cindy itself. So Cindy is just sparse over a dictionary. So in the top row, I'm showing you the filtered state, so the U's. By the way, in this example, M is 1. So you only see one snapshot of the system with these red points. So this is what you get from our method, the neural net method, and Cindy. So this one tells you exactly the benefit of doing joint optimization. So these two are doing a better job, right? Both of them kind of smear the solutions out. This also goes to your question about the shock, because you don't see data on the shock. You will never recover a sharp shock. You always have a bias towards smoothness. So you will smooth things out, but it seems like it's kind of capturing the right structure. This one doesn't do too well. It's because the estimation of the state has nothing to do with the equation. Therefore, information is not kind of being verified with your prior knowledge about the equation. This one, the second row, is the same kind of setup, but just like a little bit more interesting because the data is only on the boundary. So if we want to think about this, it's like you know the initial condition, you know the boundary condition, you see the state at time 1. And from this, you want to recover the state of the system, the whole trajectory, and the differential equation itself, okay? So this is very interesting for scientific machine learning guys because this is the kind of operator learning problem they care about. This is not actually as hard as you think for this instance because the solution is very, very smooth. So even Cindy, if you do some not good kind of cross-validation and that sort of thing, it actually recovers the state decently well. Again, you see the neural net and the kernel method are also doing the decent job. But then what I'm showing you here, this is where the difference appears. This is the operator learning task for this problem, where I now have a new F, a new initial condition. I simulate the trajectory. This is the truth. This is what our method gets. This is what the neural net gets. This is what Cindy gets. So in case of Cindy, again, because you have this disconnect, it's obviously worse, right? But here, an interesting thing appears, which is that the neural net is not doing as well as the kernel method. There's a good reason for this. The reason is typically you actually do a better job filtering the states. It's not surprising because you have the direct observation of the states. But the discovery of the equation or learning the equation is a harder task. And in a sense, it comes down to how well you can solve the optimization problem. So earlier, I kind of briefly mentioned you can't really do SGD on this thing. We actually tried doing because everybody in machine learning does SGD, so we did it too. Doesn't work for the kernel method. You wait 2 days and it drops the loss by like 1%, okay? So here, what I'm showing you is experiments on burgers using, this one is using a fixed initial condition. So think one of those panels I had. I just randomize the red points and I do more and more of them, okay? So as I increase the data, it's not surprising that Cindy and our method converge. Because Cindy, if you have a lot of data, you know the states really well, you can discover the equation really well. The neural nets bottom out. And especially if you look at the error of discovering the equation, here these shades, these are not standard deviations. We're plotting the best and worst performance over like 20 runs of the model. There are runs that it actually does decently well in discovering the equation, but it's highly dependent to your randomization of the data. Essentially, this was because every time what we found was every time you randomize even the location of the observations, just one second. If you randomize the observations, you need to retune the neural net with the optimizer and everything. And this is not just us just opening it up and doing the most basic thing. Like my student Juan literally sat down in Zoom calls with the authors of the PIN paper, and they tried warm starts and all sorts of things. As far as we can tell, at least the technology that we had, it's really hard to tune the neural net. Okay. Sorry, you have a question. Y-axis is yes. So y-axis is the relative error of estimating the nonlinearity in the equation in this one. Yeah, mean squared error over like a very dense like test set. So you have random locations where you evaluate the P. Yeah.
So are you saying that if you tried SPD on your method, you'd also get like a similar
It's really
shape,
bad.
like similar to this one?
Yeah. And I'll talk to you, I'll show a little bit more if we have time. Essentially, this method, which is this ours, they're imposing the PD constraint up to almost machine precision. And you really need to do that. If the PD is imposed with like 2 digits of accuracy, 1 digit of accuracy, you get nonsense. So it's really because the PDE ties everything together, you really need to solve it well, right? Here, similar thing, except that we also randomize the initial conditions, so there draws from a pretty smooth GP. It just makes things worse because now it's not only the data is random, but the initialization is random. So this optimization really suffers. But again, you see there's like runs of the neural net that are still good, right? So you're getting lucky with those good runs. But on average, it just doesn't do well. I personally think if you come up with a better way to train the neural net, you can probably get it to match something like the kernel method, but at least we didn't know how to do it so far. Yeah. All of them are using a known feed. In fact, with the neural net, because it's and Cindy, because they use dictionaries, we are giving them the best performing dictionaries. The kernel method, to be honest with you, I'm not like selling my own method too much, but the kernel method actually is at a bit of a disadvantage because we give it more features. Whereas the PIN and Cindy, we give them the optimal dictionaries, and we also searched over the dictionaries to pick the best ones because they're doing lasso. If you give them the right dictionary, they really have the right bias. But even then, they get, I mean, Cindy is fine, but the neural nets get stuck. Again, all of it comes down to this, the PD constraints not imposed well enough. If you go to much higher data, so if you go to like 1,000, the neural net comes down eventually and does well. The problem is really in sparse regimes. That's where you really struggle with the neural nets. Because the model class is too big, so it just has way too many things that it can do, and it struggles with that. Nice. So here's another example. So we're thinking about, okay, how far can we push this thing? So this is the solutions on the X are very smooth. They're draws from very smooth GPs. It's actually a linear second order PD, but we don't know the coefficient. So this is the coefficient. It's assumed to be unknown. But here we were pushing it to see how few observations can we make in the interior of the domain. So the color is a little off here, but each one of these panels right now has 2 red dots. You know the boundary condition, but you only know 2 data points on the interior of the domain. So this one, we were trying to kind of see how much does the method actually, how much can we push the method in the sparsity of the data, and do we actually see benefit of the sparsity in those extreme regimes? So here, what I'm showing you is these experiments I described. N is the number of snapshots, so how many pairs of U's and F's, each one seen on 2 points, 4 points, and 8 points, okay? And what I'm comparing, there's no neural net here anymore. It's the kernel method I showed you, and then what we call a two-step method. These are like Cindy, where you first estimate the U's from data, and then you use the U hats to estimate the P. So these are like the more classic methods in the literature. So the thing you want to pay attention to is the 2-point versus the 2-point. So here you can see this is the equation learning on the training data. On the training data, you're picking up about an order of magnitude in accuracy. This is purely from the joint optimization, right? Everything else between the methods is the same. This is over in distribution test data. You see a similar gap. This is out of distribution test data. We changed the length scale and the regularity of the GPs for the use. So again, you see about an order of magnitude improvement. And also in the operator learning task, where in the operator learning, now you plug in a bunch of new apps and you solve the equations that you've learned to get the use corresponding to them. So you're inverting the operator. In fact, in this case, for the operator learning test, you actually pick up almost 2 orders of magnitude in sparse data regimes. So this is telling you that if you have very sparse data, but you have multiple snapshots of the system, you can still do really well, but you really need a two-step method. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck you're going to plateau, right? Because your estimation error of each state, each one of the UMs is limited, and that's going to limit how well you can discover the equation. If you combine everything together, you can do better than that.
These examples 1D, like
This one is 2D. This one is the U is a field. The other one is X and T, so it's two-dimensional functions because we treat X space and time the same. Cool. So we have some theory for this. I won't spend time too much on it, but essentially because it has this sort of simple connection to interpolation problems, you would expect that asymptotically you should get the same kind of error bounds you would get for kernel ridge regression and kernel interpolation. So that's exactly what we get here. So you get a bound. So we're assuming sort of solvable regularities. The details of this don't really matter. Essentially, your bound looks like field distance of the observation points, the red points, to some exponent, which depends on the regularity of the solution. Because this is a statistics crowd, I can tell you this is not entirely satisfactory because this is actually a asymptotic bound, right? So if you remember from RKHS theory, you need to have dense enough mesh for these bounds to hold. So I'm actually have been thinking about something non-asymptotic here, using kind of learning theory generalization bounds for kernel methods. But for now, this is asymptotic, but still it tells you that at the estimation of the state, things behave exactly like a kernel ridge regression or kernel interpolation problem. The more interesting part is the error bound on the P, which looks the same way. Again, you have the error term coming from the functions themselves. You're going to have a second term, which involves another field distance. This is just because if you think about the two constraints, it's like, again, generalized least squares problem. So you have a constraint, interpolation constraint for the U's. You have a noisy interpolation constraint for the P. So you expect that if things converge, then you should kind of in the limit be able to essentially reduce the problem for the P also to an interpolation problem. So proving this is a little bit more technical, but at the end, the message is the same, which is the field distance to some exponent coming from the states, another field distance to some exponent coming for the P. All right, so I think I'm pretty much on time, right? Okay.
you can still say these things if you want.
Okay, I'll just put this here, just quickly tell you. So kind of going all the way to the beginning, a kernel method that I showed you that kind of tries to unify these three problems of scientific machine learning. So has a PDE solver built into it. It does equation learning and then operator learning. The key idea I wanted to get across is that this joint recovery is the right thing to do if you have sparse regime data. If it's not sparse, honestly, you want to do a two-step method like Cindy. It's much faster. The optimization problem is interesting. So there's actually a lot of details I didn't have a chance to get into. Maybe if there are questions, I can tell you. There's a lot of numerical linear algebra tricks that go into that optimization, matrix sketching and these things to get it to scale. The interesting thing is, for now, it seems like you get much, much better performance if you do two-step. Another key observation, if you looked at the scientific ML side of things, there's really no operator learning algorithm that can deal with sparse data. The reason is those things are built for high density data already. But now we have a method that allows us to kind of use the PD constraint to evaluate the solution maps, and then comes with some theoretical guarantees, but there's still work to do here as well. All right, I'm going to stop.
Thanks for the great talk. Any questions?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. You said little m, you mean here?
Yeah.
Oh, so the bound we are giving here is on the sum of so this m is the number of snapshots. Okay. So if you just multiply this by 1 over n, you will basically get like an average bound on the error between the p. Yeah. Okay. Oh, wait, I see. This is a typo. This shouldn't be there. Sorry. This shouldn't be there.
Oh.
That's my typo. I just got it. Sorry. Yeah.
So you said in general the operator is not invertible, right? But does the example I think you gave, div a drive u,
Yes.
isn't that one invertible?
P is invertible because you're assuming the PDE is uniquely solvable. P hat, the equation that you discover, is not necessarily invertible because you can imagine in your dictionary you have this, but you have a bunch of nonlinear terms also, and they might have non-zero coefficient, and then you don't know if that PDE is solvable.
Because we know this is solvable, but
Well,
in general, we don't know what it looks like.
Yeah, this guy has to be solvable for us to have data, but the one that we estimate, there's no constraint that says it should be well-defined and invertible. Yeah.
I guess a couple of connected questions. So you mentioned Gaussian processes
Yeah.
as kind of something that you guys are working on.
Mhm.
So I guess the one comment and one question. So the comment is, so if you think about kind of full Bayesian inference, so there's optimization.
Yeah.
So those bounds that you have may give you a way to think about hyperpriors on the lambda
Yeah.
prime and lambda delta prime.
Yeah.
At least to scale. So what is the right relative scale of those
Yeah.
things?
Yeah.
Across each other. So that really a practical utility of having a bound if it's not.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I guess the other comment is we were trying to make a contrast between the Gaussian process and kind of generalization type methods of dictionary. But I mean, if you think about the carbonity of representation of the Gaussian process, it's linear combination of the eigenfunctions with a Gaussian penalty. Penalty.
Yeah.
So is it really different things? I mean,
No, they're related.
yeah.
So there is, for example, for Cindy, there's already something they call Bayesian Cindy, which does like, I think it does like a horseshoe prior or something like that for the parameters. There is a difference there's a big difference in the way you actually implement the methods, because you mentioned hyperpriors. The way we actually implement this, if you go fully Bayesian, we also search for the length scales and the kernels and that sort of thing, which in the Coronel-Loew connection analogy, it means I'm actually adjusting the dictionary itself. When you do the dictionary methods, typically you fix them. There's no sort of easy way, at least I don't know of an easy way, where you can actually, in a smooth way, adjust the dictionary itself. You can do pruning type things, which they do with Cindy. They do ensembles, and then they pick the simplest models and that sort of thing. But essentially, I agree with you. There's a way you can write the two problems, and it comes down to a Gaussian prior versus like a Laplace prior, right? But the RKHS perspective, kind of part of it is the algorithm because you have quadratic approximations. The other part is things like length scale selections, connection to random fields, and so on, that just make it a little bit easier to deal with for PDE problems. But yeah, there is a very clear kind of Bayesian formulation for both.
We gotta stop, sorry, classes. But Bamdad will be outside. Yeah, additional class.
Sure.
And